And that's the reason why they do a lot more experiments with people, because it's much easier to get participants. And it came to research orientation. The focus was on the evaluation of crisis incidents. And it's kind of the crisis most researched, the general crisis, for example, financial crisis, some political issues, whatever, and then followed by mixed crisis, tempering, terror, natural disaster, human error accidents, and technical error accidents. I've tried to compare that with the international study and realized it's quite difficult, as you can't really compare it. For example, the focus on crisis incidents is mainly driven by what happens. So for example, if there is a plane crash in the United States, a lot of the researchers will evaluate exactly this crisis incident. But this crisis incident isn't really something you could refer to one country, because the plane crash could happen everywhere else. And so if, for example, 50% of the research regarding specific crisis incidents, like general crisis, so it was just the crisis happened at that time or shortly before. And because crisis is not predictable, you can't really say there are national differences, unless it's, for example, Australia is a country which is prone to bushfires. You won't have someone evaluating bushfires in Germany. So it's kind of, there are specific areas which can be related to certain countries, but most of the crisis incidents, they just happen and then they are going to be evaluated. So it's rather, you could say a coincidence. Okay. The last question of Shi-Young-Kyung's and Hui's framework was case study trends. So I looked at how many of the articles were case studies, and the majority of them were case studies, and most of them again non-theoretical, which used again the qualitative approach. So it's mirroring all the other results, which is again quite the opposite to the international study, where a little bit less were case studies, but it's kind of most of them used a theoretical approach. Whereas in Australia and New Zealand, certainly, obviously there was not a theoretical approach. One of the reasons why my numbers differ from the findings of the international study is certainly that I've included practitioners' case studies, because most of the articles published on the Public Relations Institute's websites were from practitioners, and they evaluated certain cases they had worked on. So obviously they didn't use any theories to do their work, and if you see, out of 33 articles, 8 were from practitioners, so that's quite a high percentage, and that could be an explanation for the differences. Okay. The second part of my research project was the in-depth interviews, and here's a small, a little bit of background to my participants. They were all highly qualified, and if you look especially at the Australians, they had at least 25 years of work experience, and the first three, you could say all of them. The 3 ones worked for big international PR agencies, so they didn't only work in Australia, they worked all over the world, and that's the reason why they have quite a high number of crisis cases they had worked on. In comparison, the New Zealand practitioners, although they had partly similar years of work experience, they had, it's kind of really only a few cases in comparison to the Australian ones, except this person who worked, again, all over the world. So it seems like, unless there is less happening in New Zealand, it seems like rather the practitioners who work all over the world are really the ones who are experienced. Because I asked them how often they have to work on crisis cases, and they said they can't give me a number, because if there is a crisis, they work around the clock on it, and then it could be that there isn't anything happening for months or years, and then again, if there is something happening, they have to work full-time on it. Yeah, and as you can see, they were all in leading positions, so I would say their interviews have a high credibility. Okay, the three gaps discovered in the literature were the influence of culture, applicability of strategies, and stakeholder consideration. I decided to see culture not only as national or regional culture, but as well as organizational culture and structure. So I asked them what kind of role or what kind of influence culture has on crisis communication. But I have to say, I've expected that the answers will be, has a huge impact. Because that's what literature stated, and most of the academics asked for more research in this area as they assumed there is a huge impact. Interestingly, the practitioners said it doesn't matter at all, no matter where you are, in which country. It's kind of the basics of crisis management are the same. The only thing you change is the phrasing. So you would say, for example, things differently in Japan as you would say things in New Zealand, or who the person is who's going to say it will be different. But the crisis management itself is going to be the same. So the core principles of crisis management, seeing what is the crisis, who are the key groups you need to inform, and how do you want the company to be seen in 1 or 2 years after the crisis. These remain the same no matter where you are. What they highlighted is that, for example, Asian cultures are different in terms of crisis communication, as they have a different culture. So there you don't really admit that you have a problem. You rather try to hide it and see if it goes away on its own. And if you have to admit it, you do it kind of at the least possible time or moment. So, for example, one of the practitioners mentioned the Toyota example, where Toyota, I think they had brake problems, and they just didn't tell the stakeholders early enough. So it came out that the management knew for quite a while, but it just didn't communicate it. The other example was, I think it was a Korean company in Australia, and they had problems, and so they told the management, the local management there, please to pressure the journalists not to write anything about it. And that's the last point regard to formal processes and procedures. So it might have worked in Korea to pressure journalists not to write anything, but it didn't work in Australia because it had the opposite effect. So because they tried to pressure them, they wrote even more. And another example given by one of the practitioners was an oil company in Australia where they had an explosion and 2 staff members died. So they were managing the crisis quite good, and then the company flew in the PR people and managers from the US. And then it kind of went really bad because they started, it was obvious that the employees made a mistake, so it was human error. The whole thing blew up, so they blamed the employees, which is kind of a bad thing to do in Australia because they have formal processes in place. So you have the situation, you have someone coming out from outside, someone from a government official, whoever, and they evaluate the whole situation, and then they decide what the reason for it was, and then they could tell, okay, it was maybe human error, but you don't go just there and blame the employees which died. So it went really, really bad because the strategy was okay according to the practitioner. The communication itself would have been okay, only to a different point in time. So it's kind of because they didn't know about formal processes. It's kind of they sped it up. So it's they blamed. You can blame the employees afterwards as soon as the official source stated that and confirmed that, but you can't do it before. Really, really interesting was that it seemed like all of the practitioners were quite convinced that organizational culture and structure is even more significant than a national culture. So here's one of the statements from one of the practitioners as I asked him how structure and culture influences, and his example was about a multinational company which has a CEO in one country, and something happens and the local management just can't react quickly as it should, because it has to wait for instructions from overseas, and there can be a huge delay in crisis communication just because the CEO, for example, sits in another country, speaks another language, is in another time zone, whatever. I have to say that it was sometimes really difficult to get a clear statement from the practitioners. Not that they were clear, but I had 6 different people, and all of them stated sometimes something different. So it was kind of difficult to get sometimes a clear direction or a clear trend. In this case, it was really clear because all of them said it's really, really important. And there are some examples how organizational culture can influence crisis communication. One of the local ones is Ribena. So if the communication in an organization is bad before a crisis, it won't improve during a crisis. So in the Ribena case, vital information just wasn't forwarded to the appropriate management level. I think every one of you remembers it was a school experiment where 2 girls found out that, was it the vitamin C level or something wasn't right in the Ribena juices, and they wrote them an email, and it went somewhere to a marketing person who left it on her or his desk for months and months and months until the media got to know about it, and then was already too late. So this is one of the really most important things. The other thing is leadership. So if the leader isn't on board, the crisis communication is prone to be really, really bad, because you have to have someone who owns the problem and is willing to stand in front of the cameras and tell what's happening. Related to culture is strategy applicability, because a lot of the strategies are from somewhere else. So I asked the practitioners how it is if international strategies, for example, can be applied in Australia and New Zealand. The statements differed a bit, but it's kind of, most of them said that with small adjustments, that means tailoring to local needs, you can use international strategies without problems. That means if you adjust them to local and national frameworks, as one of the practitioners stated, it's kind of the principles are similar. It's kind of the local culture you have to be aware of, and how things are done. That's again, it's kind of all that relates again to the whole processes and the way how things are done and understood and valued in that culture. And they all said that there aren't really differences between Australia and New Zealand. Only the New Zealand practitioners added that, for example, when it comes to strategy, because New Zealand is such a small country, it's easier to get hold of, for example, government officials. You have a closer relationship to the media. So it's kind of, it can influence it in that way, that it's because New Zealand is smaller, you can do things a little bit differently on a more personal level. I also asked them if there is a best strategy approach, because a lot of the academics in the literature and the articles of my literature review stated that they would like to have a best strategy approach. So that means in situation X, which strategy is most useful. Interestingly, the practitioner said there is not really a best practice approach. It's kind of the principles of crisis communication to be quick, direct, open, honest. They apply in every situation.